What I'm going to do with you today is go through a whirlwind, excuse me, a whirlwind view of the mind and try to explore how it relates to coaching as we go. And in doing this, I want to acknowledge from the very beginning that what you're about to hear relates to what the introductory talks presented, which is, what William James said, that we're going to be stretching our minds. So I appreciate that some of this is going to be old stuff, some of this is going to be new and familiar stuff, some of this is going to be new and completely unfamiliar stuff, and you're going to roll your eyes and say, he's out of his mind, why'd they bring him here? And I appreciate that. And it makes my work kind of a little bit lonely, so I need some friends, and so I'm hoping at least some of you won't kick me out completely. All right, so here's how we're going to do this. We're going to look at some very basic questions that address many of the important points that Dan presented earlier. And I guess since my name is Dan, I don't have to keep on saying Dan Goleman. So if you know I'm saying Dan, I mean Dan Goleman. Unless I'm talking to myself, which when you get lonely, sometimes you do. Okay, so what we're going to do is ask some basic questions like, does a coach need to know anything about the mind? The next question, of course, is, what is the mind? How would you even begin to answer that second question? And another question is, how do relationships have anything to do with the mind, right? If you've got your own mind, why is it that all the studies of happiness and health and longevity point to one factor that's shared in common, which is supportive relationships? Why is it that each of the 5 factors that Dan beautifully pointed out leads to this emotional hijacking or an amygdala hijacking? We're all relational. Why is relational assault mediated in the brain by the exact same circuits that mediate physical injury? Right? These are really, really fundamental questions. And when you think about what you do in coaching, they're relevant because as a coach, of course, you're working with systems of human beings, usually, communicating with each other in relationships. So we have to ask even the fundamental question, what is a relationship? And then, of course, we can get into this whole sexy area of neuroscience, which has to be really treated with incredible humility, because if you're a true scientist, you know the most common phrase you should be saying is, I don't know, right? And when you see scientists in their work embrace that phrase, it's very, very reassuring and humbling. And I'll just start with a very brief story that 33 years ago, this is a Harvard presentation, at this institute, and I was a medical student here at Harvard, and I was wrestling with an incredible sadness that what I had worked for so long in high school and college to achieve, to go to medical school and everything, was turning into one of the most disastrous experiences I had ever had. And the professors, many of the professors I had as I was entering clinical practice, had absolutely no concern about the internal experience of their patients, like what they felt, like what an illness might mean to them, like what their life story was, like what the context in which their lives were that this illness was emerging. It was shocking. And I was trained as a biochemist, and when I was in college, I had worked trying to find out the enzyme that allowed salmon to go from fresh water to salt water and not die, and we actually found it. And at the same time, at night, I had found this poster, and I decided to volunteer for the suicide prevention service. And I never even thought about that kind of thing, because I'm really a biologist at heart. So I went, and I was trained as a helpline worker, and I was taught that the way you speak to a human being on the phone in an empathic way could make the difference between life and death. And I always had the feeling back then as a teenager when I was in college, there must be something fundamentally similar about relationship communication that saves a life and an enzyme that allowed a salmon to swim in the ocean, right? There had to be something that was similar. And somehow in my idealism, I thought that the best place to figure out the answer to those questions would be medical school. And there's a lot of physicians. How many physicians are in the room, by the way? So you know that that was like the most ridiculous assumption. But what shocked me was how, I didn't know it at the time, in fact, I don't think we knew it then, that there were these two fundamental ways of seeing reality. There was the way of perceiving the physical world and the way of perceiving the internal subjective world. And of course that's feelings, but it's more than feelings. It's your thoughts, it's your images, it's the sensations you have, it's your narrative, it's your story. There's a lot about the internal world which we'll just call the see inside that my professors were not seeing. And it wouldn't be until, almost 30 years later that there'd be a study that showed if you're a physician seeing a person even with a common cold and you're empathically connecting with them in just a 10-minute visit, that patient will get better a day sooner and their immune function will be better than if you just coldly, mechanically say, okay, you have a cold, these are the symptoms, this is the treatment, goodbye. Which was exactly like many of my professors were treating, not only the patients, but even us, their students. I remember one time I was crying because one of my patients that I'd been taking care of for a month had died. And my attending saw me crying and he pulled me aside. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, Mr. Smith just passed away and, I've been with him for a month." And he goes, "There's no time for tears." Like that. And that happened over and over again. I won't bore you with the stories. But I just want to begin the talk with that, being back here now a third of a century later, speaking about this field I work in now called interpersonal neurobiology. Because the short version of this journey is I came back after I dropped out of medical school, came back here, finished my degree, went into pediatrics, changed to psychiatry because I was very interested in the mind, went through adult training, child training, became a research fellow, and then ultimately became the training director in child psychiatry. And what was shocking to me, even being trained as a psychiatrist, is no one was talking about what the mind was. It was really kind of strange. And so I got a bunch of scientists together back in 1992, the beginning of the decade of the brain, to ask the fundamental question, what is the connection between the brain and the mind? And there's a whole long story there, but the bottom line is this group of 40 scientists had no shared definition of what the mind is. In fact, they had no definition of the mind. They had descriptions, but whether they were from anthropology or linguistics or sociology or psychology even, or we have people from philosophy, computer science, mathematics, systems theory. There were people from neuroscience, of course, and genetics. No one had a definition of mind, which was strange because I was trained as a psychiatrist. I was board certified in everything you could be boarded in, and I never heard what the mind was. But what is psyche? What's the definition of psyche? The soul, the spirit, the intellect, and the mind are considered synonyms. So if you're a psychiatrist, iatrist is caretaker of the mind. And I want to be clear, when I'm using the word mind, I am absolutely not distinguishing thoughts from feelings and saying, oh, thoughts are the mind and feelings are the heart. Not at all. So for now on, you understand, in my presentation of the word mind, it's more something that has to do with subjective experience, consciousness, even non-consciousness. And in this group, we needed something that would hold it together. So I offered a definition that I'll show you in a moment. In fact, do you have slides in your book? Okay. Half the time I do slides, half the time I don't. And what's really fun is that the feedback is always, he shouldn't have used any slides if I do, and if I don't, they say I should use slides. So anyway, so we'll go to some slides. So you have some slides because I thought we would match with Dan. So these slides are something that are an outline of what we're going to talk about. And I've overseen the editing of 36 professional textbooks in a field that emerged from that group called interpersonal neurobiology, which basically what we do is we take all branches of science and we combine them into one perspective. So this is a term I made up, interpersonal neurobiology, to embrace everything from the relational and the societal and stuff like that. That's the interpersonal, which includes the intrapersonal, the inner, and the betweenness. So it's not just social, but it's interpersonal. And then the neuroscience just was a term. The interpersonal neurobiology was just to say, okay, we're going to talk about biological mechanisms, talk about physics, talk about everything from this minute, molecular nature of reality all the way to this relational nature of reality. So interpersonal neurobiology is a field that is completely different from a field that emerged after that was formed called social neuroscience. Just so you know, they sound similar, and I've really wanted to change the name, but we already have these 36 textbooks out in this field, so the name will stick. But it's not the same as social neuroscience. We are a way of understanding reality that combines all sciences into one perspective. And in doing that, then, there's some really exciting implications for coaching. So we are a basic science that draws on all ways of knowing, including after science, we embrace contemplative ways of understanding reality. We look at the arts, right? We look at religion. We look at all sorts of ways that you can know about truth. Science is just one important but one limited way that informs us. There are lots of ways of knowing about reality. So if we can put on the slides, am I in charge of that here? I am, okay. So the idea here is that we're going to try to look at how this human being that you help coach has a mind. And we're going to look at what the definition was that was offered 20 years ago and see if it has any merit for coaching. And then we're going to go into some pretty wild places. So if you have your seatbelts on, put them, make sure they're clicked, because this is going to be a wild ride. And I appreciate it. This could be a 16-hour lecture, for sure. But it starts with the simplicity of all of us coming into the world wide-eyed, curious, really wanting to know. And so I'm going to ask you to consider returning to this new mind, this fresh, open way of seeing reality, knowing that once we engage in experience, memory starts filtering perception through models that shape our way of knowing reality. And so I'm going to ask you to do something really kind of wild. I'm going to ask you to be very careful of the words I'm using and the words you're using, because words are fantastic and they're also prisons. So we have to be super careful about their beauty and their restrictiveness. So she's just to remind you that we all started there and we all actually once had open minds. So now, here's a take-home slide. We'll start out with a take-home point, which is that in coaching, the reason relationships are so profoundly important is because when relationships have a fundamental process that we'll be talking about a lot called Mindsight, the ability to actually see inside the see inside, which is a phrase I love and half of my friends think it's really goofy, but I love it. You want to be able to see inside the see inside. So the reason I dropped out of school was because it was so painful to be around role models who were modeling for me ways of not seeing inside the see inside, and it was really, really, really humiliating, distressing, discouraging, and really a bad example of clinical work. And as you can hear from Dan's beautiful talk, it's actually a bad example of leadership. Mindsight, Dan wrote in the foreword to a book I wrote called Mindsight, is the mechanism beneath emotional intelligence and social intelligence. It's the way we not only see inside the see inside, but we also promote this thing called neural integration, which you're going to hear about a lot. So this is the take-home slide, because what I want to suggest to you is that any coaching model that teaches Mindsight and its corollary, which is how to promote within relationships integration, will create an opportunity for companies, organizations, groups to actually be more effective in what they do, to be more innovative in what they do, to be more upbeat in what they do, that if Dan and I do this, and we might do this in the future, if we were doing this like literally Dan squared and doing a square dancing, we would have this fun opportunity where I could take Dan's slides and I could show you how every single one of his points is an example of using Mindsight to promote integration. Now you may say that is really weird. And I hope you'll see it's not so much weird. It's weird in the beginning, but afterwards it gets a little really exciting, because then you see, when you see the fundamental mechanism beneath it, you can say, for example, to a physician, why only seeing half of reality, the physical reality and not the mental side of reality, is actually not a clinically appropriate way to be. And if I could get those professors back here, and in fact, I was asked to give a keynote address over at the medical school in Shattuck, and to talk about mindfulness in medical education. And I had this whole talk, because I was just coming out with this book called The Mindful Brain, and I had it all ready to go, and I came there, and all the deans that had been deans when I was in school were there, and they're all retired now. And sadly, I think many of them aren't alive now, but Dean Tostison was there, Dean Fetterman, all of my deans were there. So I didn't show the slides. I said, all right, I've got to tell you what happened to me and why I dropped out of school. And I was on a curriculum committee with you too. I was. And what happened? And John Kabat-Zinn, a friend of ours, was sitting in the back, and I couldn't see this because the lights were blaring, but he said they were just crying during the whole thing. You know, and because now we can have a science of this, you see? Now we can have a science of why seeing the mind of patients is essential. It's not what they were telling me in just a few blocks from here. When I was asking a patient about how he felt, that he had sickle cell trait and his brother had sickle cell anemia and was dying, and what it meant to him, and the professor pulled me aside and said, why don't you go to social work school? That's not what doctors do. I said, what do you mean? He goes, doctors don't talk to their patients about their feelings or what has meaning for them. If you like that stuff, go to graduate school in social work. And actually, I got the application after, which probably would have been a good thing to do. Anyway, so this is the idea. So we're going to go into this stuff. And the fantastic thing about having a simple mechanism beneath, like both emotional intelligence, social intelligence, you know, I was trained in my research years as an attachment researcher. So Secure Base and Bowlby and Ainsworth, Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby worked together to create attachment theory, and learning their material and working with Mary Main, who's a professor at Berkeley, in that whole field. For me, all of attachment can be summarized with the one word, like in The Graduate when he says plastics. This is the word mindsight. You know, you can show across all the studies of attachment that parents who see the mind, and remember, that's not thoughts versus feelings, that's the internal see, the internal subjective experience, the feelings, the thoughts, the memories, the perceptions, the attitudes, the intentions, the hopes, the dreams, the beliefs, all of this internal aspect of our mental lives, when it's seen, that's called mindsight. And when it's seen and honored and respected, that's a form of integration, as you're going to see. And all of attachment research can be summarized by mindsight promotes integration. And then you can understand all the studies and why applying secure-based modeling to coaching works. Because we all are human beings in need of a sense of 4 S's. We need to be seen. It's fundamental to the brain. The brain is a social organ. We absolutely need to be seen. That's why the people get better when they come with a common cold. You need to be seen, not just managed. You need to be safe. It's why when you're in a relationship that's not safe, your whole system of fight, flight, freeze gets activated, and you can't be open and receptive, and you can't be innovative or connecting, really. So you have to be safe. For a child especially, but probably in coaching, you can tell me, you need to be soothed. So when you're distressed, you have a place in which your distress can be calmed. And all of that, being seen, safe, soothed, creates a feeling of security. So the secure base idea is all about these 4 S's. And how you promote that in an organization would likely create a sense of safety. And if you look at the work of Steve Porges, and Steve just published his book with our interpersonal neurobiology series on the polyvagal theory, but I'll just give you the summary of it. Basically, the brain has 2 states. It has a receptive state and a reactive state. And if I had a whole bunch more time, I would actually do a bunch of experiential exercises because a part of my mind is going, do it with them, do it with them. And I'll do it with you. I'll do it with you anyway. I'll just talk faster, a lot faster. Wow. Okay, so just close your eyes for a moment, and I'm going to just give you the experience of these 2 states. And maybe next time we'll have 16 hours to do this. Okay, so just let yourself feel whatever you feel. And this will be an exercise you'll do now, but you can also do this in your coaching. Okay, so just, I'm going to repeat a word several times. I'm going to pause. Then I'll repeat another word several times. I'll pause, and then we'll end the exercise. No. 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 Yes. 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 And now when you're ready, you can open your eyes if they're closed. And let's do just a quick survey. How many of you felt the difference between no and yes? Raise your hand. Okay, so throw out some words. What did no feel like? Stiff, harsh, annoying, disconnecting, scary, okay? Punitive, attacking, okay? And what did yes feel like? Connection, soothing, calming, encouraging. Great. So the brain has these 2 fundamental states, a no state and a yes state. A no state activates the fight, flight, freeze response, depending on our temperament, our history, all sorts of things. And the receptive state is a yes state. It actually changes our physiology that you can read about in a 400-page book all about this one reaction called the polyvagal theory. And in the polyvagal theory, you talk about literally the neural circuitry of the receptive state versus the reactive state. But the take-home message for coaching is that when we're in a reactive state, we're not open to not only learning, but we're not open to connecting, we're not open to being empathic. We're in a protective mode of fight, flight, freeze. Or if it's really severe and we feel completely helpless, we go to collapse. Those are kind of 4 reactions we can get into. Different aspects of the polyvagal, the 10th cranial nerve is involved in different aspects of this. Those details don't matter right now. But the bottom line is it's very different from the part of the 10th cranial nerve system, the polyvagal system. The vagus nerve is the 10th nerve. That leads to the receptive state. And the receptive state is a relaxing of one's whole physiology and an opening of the system, literally, not only musculature, but neurologically, you become open to new learning. And in that state of receptivity is where innovation and creativity arise. It's where connection and a feeling of belonging emerge. And that's what a coach wants to inspire a leader to create in an organization, to become a yes organization. Okay, and when you look at this whole Mindsight thing, you see the way in which relationships shape that. So what I'm going to do now for you is tell you some information that is, for me, foundational in going forward, not only in this talk, but in really saying, how does interpersonal neurobiology have a relevance to coaching? And I'm going to share with you some data let me quickly give you the background resources. So if you do get an interest in this, we have, as I mentioned, dozens of textbooks that apply this to mental health primarily. There are a few now coming out in the field of education, and there's some people that I'm working with talking about applying this to coaching. Those are books. There's online programs at the Mindsight Institute if you want to learn more. And in particular, this whole issue of the definition of mind, if you don't want like a reference-heavy textbook, like this book I wrote called The Developing Mind, and you want stories, the book Mindsight has a lot of stories that make this just very real and human. If you want to know how to do this in yourself as a coach, The Mindful Therapist would be a good book to use. It should have been called The Mindful Person, people tell me, but anyway, it's called what it's called. So that actually walks you through this. If you want just a fun kind of non-linear book that lets you explore this material in a kind of way that knowledge becomes your own, there's a book called Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology, which is this kind of, it's like a hologram of knowledge, and you weave it however is relevant for you. And so that's Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology. And then finally, there are two books for parenting, if you're into parenting. Parenting from the Inside Out and Whole Brain Child are two books I wrote with colleagues, and you'll find applications there. So this is the seatbelt part of the talk. We're about to go into this wild place, and I'm anchoring you in those available resources because I know that 1 hour is not enough time to really do justice to what I'm about to do, but without giving you a flavor for this, you won't get a feeling for what this is about. So the first fact I'm going to tell you about is, for me, shocking. I have asked 8,500 educators whose job it is to educate the mind of the next generation if they've ever been given a definition of the mind, and I'll give you the results in a moment. And I have asked, and this is not an exaggeration, this is a documented fact, I've asked 100,000 mental health professionals in rooms like this if they've ever had even one lecture, forget a course, but even a lecture that said what the mind is. Now, how many of you are coaches? We did that before, but it's almost everybody, right? So let's just do this in this room. How many of you in your coaching training have had a lecture, not by me, but had a lecture that said what the mind is? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. This is bigger than any. What's 14 out of 750? What is that? Actually, it's large. What are you kidding? There's a margin of error. So it's about what? 2%. Oh, okay. So that's about the average. All right. So that's actually what it is around the world for therapists. 2%. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes 4. The max I've ever seen is 5. 2%. 2 to 5%. So we can say very clearly 95% of mental health professionals, and the same is true with educators. This is one group, so we don't know for coaches, but you could do your study. Of 100,000 mental health professionals, over 95% have never even had one lecture on what the mental means of mental health. And this isn't even getting to the whole issue of positive psychology, which is so fascinating, because of course, mental health professionals never even hear about health. They're just thinking about disorders, right? And so it should be a field of, what is that thing? Disorder. Okay, so this is the funny thing. So in this group, I had to come up with a definition because the 40 scientists couldn't come up with one. And here is a working definition that we've been working with for 20 years that has profound implications for coaching, mental health, education, parenting, and all sorts of things related to well-being. What we're going to say is this, that the unit of analysis is something people usually don't think about, and I presented this in all sorts of different groups, and people go, I don't understand what that is. And I appreciate this is really, really a hard concept. But for me, the way to connect the relationships that we talk about, the brain and the mind, is through the unit of energy and information. And I've had professors, chairmen of psychology, say to me, don't ever talk about energy and psychology in the same breath. And I say, why not? They go, because it's insulting to psychology. I said, why? They go, because energy is not scientific. And I said, isn't physics like a branch of science? And they go, well, physics has nothing to do with psychology. I said, what? And they go, because physics is a different domain of reality than the mind. I said, wow, I didn't know there were different domains. Isn't there like reality? So this irritates people so much. I have, especially senior people in the field. And this one guy, finally, when we were at this meeting together, he said, look, I'm about to retire. I'm too tired to think of new things. And I just felt so sad for his graduate students. Anyway, okay. So if you think about a relationship fundamentally as sharing energy and information flow, and we'll define energy and information in a moment, like what's happening between me and you, not ethereal, but literally my voice box is moving air molecules. That's kinetic energy of air molecules. It moves your tympanic membrane, which is your eardrum, and that's kinetic movement in the eardrum. And then what happens inside your head is what? The movement is electrochemical energy transformation. The movement of the eardrum is transferred into movement of hair cells and all sorts of things, but ultimately you have ions flowing in and out of membranes, and then you have the release of chemicals. The brain is basically all about electrochemical energy transformation. That's it. In all sorts of really exciting, sophisticated ways that we don't know much about, but that's what it does. A relationship is always about the sharing of energy and information. So energy takes lots of forms: kinetic energy, electrical energy, light energy, like the way you see me as photons are bouncing off this body and coming into your retina, and it's activating electrochemical transformations of energy. So why this psychologist would be so upset about talking about energy, I don't know. I had the most senior person in psychology on the planet with me on a trolley car in San Francisco, and I said to him, among all these people, isn't it interesting that the field of psychology has no definition of mind? He goes, we don't? I said, well, do you? He goes, you're right, we don't. And I said, and we're on this trolley car and everyone's gathering around. I go, oh, would you like to hear one? He goes, yeah. So I told him the definition I'm about to tell you. He goes, oh my God, that fits everything I've been doing for the last 50 years of my life. And what was so interesting about it was no one seems to have noticed that we have had no definition, whether it's psychiatry, psychology, sociology, which is so curious. There was a book published just through this city where it was all, the mind was the first name in the title of the book, and they had a glossary of all the beautiful things they talked about in the book. And you know what they used as a definition of mind in the glossary? They forgot to put the entry in. For real. And it was my editor who was overseeing that book. And I called her up. I said, do you know what you put as mind? She said, what? I said, you didn't. It's just common to ignore it. It's the strangest thing. Anyway, so energy is shared between people. And when energy has a form that has symbolic value, let's just use that. So if I say Golden Gate Bridge, there is energy of air molecules moving, but it's symbolizing something other than the air molecules moving. So it's information. If I just go like that, now you can draw, oh, I'm happy for you to be here because I'm clapping, but just the straight sound, if I go, that would be just pure energy. There's not that much information, although maybe for a baby there is, but for us there isn't that information. Okay. The brain is the embodied mechanism through which energy and information flow. That's what the brain is all about. It's about electrochemical energy transformations that sometimes symbolize something other than electrons flowing through membranes. And the mind, what in the world is the mind? Now here's where I feel very, very scared to say this to you, because it's a definition that I've had people look at and say, well, there's nothing wrong with it, but let's not define the mind. They say, philosophers especially will say, you should never have a definition of the mind because it will limit your understanding once you put a word on something, which is really sweet, to say that. And a scientist who's studying the mind might say, it's a word we use as a placeholder for the unknown. That's why we're studying it. We don't know what it is, which you got to totally respect that. And of course, the mind has subjective experience and consciousness, which we really don't know much about. So I'm not trying to explain those away. But if I'm a psychotherapist, or if you're a coach helping the mind in an organization, it actually is quite important to define what it is you're helping. Doesn't that make sense? I felt like a fraud when I started practicing psychotherapy back in the early 90s when I finished my training. I was a training director. I was working at night so I could pay the mortgage. My wonderful wife, Caroline, was here. And I felt like a fraud because if people said, hey, you're hanging out a shingle saying you're a psychotherapist, right? I'm a psychiatrist practicing therapy. I'm a psychotherapist. What is that psyche thing you're going to therapize in me? And I go, well, it's an unknown. I don't know what it is, you know, or gosh, I don't want to define it because let's just see where it goes. I wouldn't go to me, you know. Caroline, my wife, is a lawyer, and if I went out with her law school friends and said, hey, when you were in law school, did anybody define what a law is? And 95% of them said, gosh, no, that's an interesting question. Would you hire them? So what I'm about to do is offer you a definition of mind that I think can help coaching transform what you do. So here's how it goes. Again, this is why this could be a long story, and if you have some time, oh no, you're doing something else this weekend. I was going to invite you to come spend the weekend with me in the Berkshires, but you're here. So here's how it works. If you think about energy and information flow as the unit of the system you're looking at, complex systems, I'm not going to get into the physics of all that, but complex systems are systems that are open to influences from outside of themselves, like a human being or like a relationship or like an organization. And they are chaos capable, like a human being, a relationship, or an organization. So a system that's comprised of interacting elements that is chaos capable and open to things outside of itself is called a complex system. The mathematics, this is math now, even another layer from physics. The mathematics of complex systems say that, or says, anyway, what emerges from the math is that you have a process that arises from the interaction of elements of the system. This becomes very important. And in arising from the interaction of the elements of the system, it actually goes back and regulates that from which it arose in a process called self-organization. Now that seems really weird, and is weird. It's called recursivity. It's recursive. Yes, you heard it right. Arising from interactions of elements of the system is a self-organizing process that comes back and regulates it. It regulates that from which it arose. It doesn't seem intuitive, and it's not intuitive, but it's absolutely solidly based in mathematics. Self-organizing systems don't have a program. There's no Microsoft self-organization that you have to update. It's just a fundamental property of the system. Okay, so I said to these folks, what if we think of the mind? Not so much subjective experience, who knows what that is? That's fascinating, but who knows? Not even consciousness. Maybe it's related, maybe it's not, but let's leave those aside for a moment. A third aspect of the mind you see here, an emergent self-organizing process that emerges from and also regulates the flow of energy and information within the body and within our relationships. And amazingly, if you've ever been in academics, you know why this is amazing. There was 100% agreement among the 40 scientists that this was something, though they didn't have any definition of the mind, this was a definition they could buy into, and instead of the group dissolving after a few meetings, it met for 4.5 years, addressing one question: what is the connection between the brain and the mind? It was an amazing experience, and for me, it gave birth to the idea that you need to combine all disciplines of knowing together. Everybody's got something to share. You know, and it's like the blind man and the elephant. You don't just take a person who's studying the toe or the tail or whatever. You got to have some place in which the whole elephant is seen. And so interpersonal neurobiology, as far as I understand, is the only place in which we bring all sciences together into one. And so we aren't a form of therapy. We inform therapy by giving this transdisciplinary way of consilience is what E.O. Wilson calls finding the common universal principles across independent disciplines. It's a consilient approach. Okay, so what are the lessons that emerge from that? Just as a visual, this diagram says this is our unit where we're always looking. If we're looking at emotional intelligence, social intelligence, organizational functioning, the health in a relationship, psychotherapy, parenting, anything, we always return to this triangle of well-being. And this is this idea that these three elements are fundamentally inextricably interwoven. You cannot separate any of the three from each other. It's not possible. Because I've had people look at this slide. Literally, I was giving a talk to the emeritus professors at UCLA who are really getting into this. And a professor who was not emeritus, who was active, a researcher, stood up and said, "You are reversing science with that slide." And everyone went, "What?" And I go, "Tell me more. What do you mean?" And he goes, "We've worked for 40 years in psychology to show that the mind is not separate from the brain." And I said, "Well, if you heard what I just said before you interrupted, it was that these are inextricably linked. This is like a coin with heads, tails, and an edge. You don't take a coin and say, well, this is just tails. No, it's got a head on the other side, it's got an edge." And he just couldn't get it. He just couldn't get it. I said, this is an emergent property of energy and information flow. That's the unit. The unit is not the skin. The unit is certainly not the brain, my God. The unit is energy and information flow. It's why relationships are the context in which our mental lives are born, because they aren't constrained by the skin. Now this, some people have called me un-American, actually, seriously. They said, "This is un-American what you're saying." I said, "Why is it un-American?" They're saying, "This diagram says I don't own my mind." I say, "Yeah, it does say that. It means I'm like interdependent with other people." I say, "Yeah, it says that. Because that's un-American." We should stand on our own in this continent, I'm serious. So this evokes lots of emotions, which are interesting. Now, David Rock and I came up with this healthy mind platter, just to say this, where if you take this definition of mind and say, well, how do you create a healthy mind? Just like you might have the FDA say, what are you supposed to eat? This is stuff you can see on the website, but I'll just say this here. There are fundamental ways you can take relationships and the brain and actually then say, what are some things you have to do every day to keep your mind healthy, right? So it's a healthy mind platter. And these are all kind of intuitive, but they're based on science, and we just wrote an extensive research article just pointing to the research on this. Sleeping is really important, of course, for immunological health, for metabolic health, and for brain health. Physical time, keeping your body active, really, really important. So an organization, if you took this poster and hung it up all around the organization, you'd have people with healthier minds if you can encourage them to do that. Active time really helps the brain function, for sure, in all sorts of ways. There you see focus time. The close paying of attention harnesses the power of the brain to change across a lifespan. So what we know from neuroscience is that neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to change its structure in response to experience, happens until the day you die. And part of the way you get the brain to change is by the close paying of attention. Just like Dan was referring to beautifully, not continuous partial attention, but focused attention. And it's part of what happens in flow, is this focus time. Connecting time, I think of as 3G, 2P. You want to connect with gratitude, with generosity, and a sense of giving back, or like some people like gifting back. To the 2P, those are 3 Gs, generosity, gratitude, and giving back or gifting back. The 2 Ps are to people and the planet. So when you see organizations that talk about sustainability, that talk about really promoting this kind of connectivity, this would relate to connecting time. Unbelievably important because the mind is born from connection. It just is. I know that sounds un-American, but hey, it's scientific. Okay, connecting time. Playtime. You got to be goofy. You got to be silly. And even in the face of the suffering of the world, the Dalai Lama was mentioned a few times today, and Dan and I have both, Dan's talked with him extensively in other settings, I've talked with him as well. And the Dalai Lama was once asked, how can you be so jovial when there's so much pain in the world, and you're trying to encourage us to be more empathic, and that sucks because, something, the world's full of pain, why should I be more sensitive to the world's pain? And his response was exquisite. He said, it isn't in spite of the world's suffering that you need to be joyful and humorous. It's actually because of it. If you let yourself become downtrodden and totally collapsing in your spirit, he said the suffering will have won. So it's actually your responsibility to be he didn't use the word playful, but to be playful, spontaneous, open, really lighthearted. Very, very, very important. Then you have downtime, which is the time for just not having something that you're doing in an organized way. Really important to let the brain kind of just resort itself, let relationships resort themselves. Downtime, very important. And then there's this process that I call time in, which, talking to Dan and talking to Jack Kornfield and John Kabat-Zinn and stuff, it's a phrase that just encapsulates the idea that if every human being on the planet could learn to pause and reflect inwardly in a way I'm going to explore with you right now in a lot of depth, we'd have a different planet. And if an organization could encourage time in every day, even for 5 minutes, it'd be like, there was once a period where people didn't brush their teeth before World War II. People didn't brush their teeth. And now you brush your teeth every day, and you had dental hygiene, there you go. This is a way of having, and I'm not going to say mental floss, but time in is like a way of getting rid of the junk in your synaptic connections. So it is a way of daily doing this. You wouldn't say, I brushed my teeth 2 months ago. You could say that, but people would run away. So you want to do this on a daily basis. This is what we should be doing as coaches, is encouraging all of these 7, actually, but especially time in. Now let's talk about why time in works and why it relates to the marshmallow study that Dan explored. So this is just a recap so you can really see it clearly. We are now defining the mind. The mind includes awareness, which some people call consciousness. It also includes processes that happen outside of consciousness. It includes subjective experience, the inner felt texture of lived life that no one can explain at all. How in the world you have an internal subjective experience that somehow relates to ions flowing in and out of membranes and chemicals going across. Because no matter what you say about that, or no matter how sophisticated we get about the prefrontal, the amygdala, this, that, blah, 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 all sorts of fascinating things that I'm absolutely addicted to, the reality is that is not subjective experience. Your textured experience is not ions flowing in and out of a membrane. So while they correlate to each other, what we're learning is they may be bidirectional in causation. You may be able to mold your subjective experience to get your brain to fire in a certain way. And oh, does that get people mad when I say that? They say, no, the brain is always causing subjective experience. I say, show me the data. And the data actually, they say, well, if you kill a brain, subjective experience disappears. Sure. If you kill subjective experience, the brain will die too. If you kill relationships, the child will die. What's with that? So it's not so simple as just an arrogant attitude of saying it's one directional. You got to be really, really careful about it. That's the leading model. The brain creates subjective experience, but we don't have any data for that. So you have to be open-minded to know which way is it going. And as you'll see, the way you drive energy and information through the brain actually changes the brain's function and structure. So attention is the process that drives energy and information flow. Okay. Now, what this requires, of course, is that you have that new mind, because most of us grow up in a modern world reading New York Times and Time magazine saying, oh yes, the brain creates the mind. But it's not that simple. At least from this talk, consider the possibility that energy and information flowing through your body, not just your head, and between you and others, called relationships, is where the mind arises. So as a coach, you now have a little bit of a different perspective. There are 2 places you need to help your clients focus on mental life. 1, the whole body, not just neural structures in the skull. And I call that the embodied brain, just to pull the brain into it, but remember the body. It's got to be the embodied brain. Number 2, relationships. And so when you see that, you can come up with a really amazing finding, which is a proposal that not many people buy into, but when I wrote about it in '99, people said that sounds totally goofy. And then between '99 and 2012, a huge amount of research came out independently that didn't prove, but supported in predictive ways. That is, in '99, this proposal predicted certain outcomes, and then in this ensuing decade, those outcomes came true. And that's what you do in science. You have a pre-existing hypothesis. You then do independent fields of study that were based on the hypothesis, and the hypothesis predicts them. So this hypothesis is that health, whether it's in an organization or a relationship or in a human individual, comes from a process called integration. And I know it sounds simple, but it's had incredible predictive value for psychotherapy, for family functioning, even for organizational functioning. Integration is defined as the linkage of differentiated parts. So you connect separate areas together. You connect two people in a relationship where they're allowed to be different, and then their differences are enjoyed, and you thrive on differences, but then you link with compassionate communication. That's honoring differences, promoting linkages. When you do that, amazingly, here's what you find from the mathematics of complex systems. And you've got to read beyond just the math, because the terms are very different in math, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology. The terminology is completely different. So you've got to look beneath the words at the deeper meanings embedded in the way they're seeing reality. Okay? So that's what we do in interpersonal neurobiology. We actually look beneath the words, because the words will get you nowhere. That's why they're separate disciplines, because they have different wording. But here's the idea, and I spent a week with 150 physicists and mathematicians drilling them about this, so I feel really excited to affirm from math and physics, even though the words are different, here's the finding. When a complex system is integrated, when it's linking its differentiated parts, it moves in harmony, which has these characteristics, spell the word faces. It's flexible, F, it's adaptive, A, it's coherent, which is a mathematical term, sticks together and modulates itself as it goes, that's coherent. It's energized and it's stable. Faces, flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized and stable, is exactly what you want in an organization. A faces movement of the organization. Coherence could also be seen as creative. A faces flow is created when you have the linkage of differentiated parts of a system. That's the faces flow. Now, when the system is not integrated, here's the amazing thing. It goes to either chaos or it goes to rigidity. Now, you won't see the word integration in the math, because integration just means addition in mathematics. So you have to look beneath it, but it's a linkage of differentiated parts, which in common language we call integration. So as a therapist, I went to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I opened that book up to any page, and on every single page, every single symptom of every single syndrome in the DSM, which has no conceptual framework at all, never talks about health, doesn't ever talk about the mind, seriously, every single symptom of every single syndrome was an example of chaos, rigidity, or both. I had 15 interns work with me to revise The Developing Mind, and I said, prove this whole book is wrong. So for the second edition, we'll make a brand new book. It doesn't matter. The idea is truth. Who cares if that was right or wrong? And they were blown away, because they found this to be true over and over and over again. They were like falling down, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. It was just like they couldn't, because their task was to disprove it all. So here's the amazing thing. If in an organization you can approach coaching with this simple model that has incredible power. When an organization is not being innovative, it's stuck in rigid patterns of functioning, you got to ask, is integration impaired? If an organization is flailing around and chaotically manifesting itself in all sorts of ways, is integration impaired? And then your job would be to find the domain of integration that's impaired within the organizational structure. And as Dan said, the leadership can inspire ways of being, and so we would then interpret some of what Dan said through the lens of integration. That a secure-based leader is promoting integration by honoring differences and really connecting deeply in linkages. Okay, so then when you have that model, then you have these domains of integration that form these basic Mindsight principles. Remember, Mindsight is more than just insight and empathy. Mindsight is the ability to see the C inside, whether it's yourself or others, and move that C toward integration. So Mindsight is different from mindfulness, for example. Mindsight includes mindfulness, but it's a much bigger construct, because we're specifically looking at integration as the outcome of a perceptual process. So these are principles. The mind is viewed as an emergent self-organizing process. that regulates energy and information flow. The mind is both embodied, it's within us, and it's relational, it's between us. Regulation entails the monitoring and modifying of energy and information flow. This is a key point that we're going to focus on for the final part of this talk. Harmony emerges from integration, the linkage of differentiated parts of a system, and chaos and rigidity result from impaired integration. Now, watch this. If you say as a coach, I'm going to go into this organization, and I'm going to strengthen the mind of the leaders of this organization so they can strengthen the functioning of this organization, you say, well, how in the world do I do that? Now you know how to do it. Regulation always entails two aspects: the monitoring and the modifying of that which is the system that it's regulating. So now we have some very clear definitions. What is it exactly you'll be monitoring? You tell me. Energy and information flow, right? Flow is change across time. Information is symbolic patterns of energy flow. And then what you see is you get the opportunity to teach people to have a high resolution focus of their attention on energy and information flow. And where would that be? You tell me. Two places. The body and relationships, exactly. So now you have a very different model. So when you leave here, when we get to the break, you know that to have a strong mind, you've got to monitor energy and information flow in two places, the body and relationships, always both, emotional, social, if you want to call it emotional. In fact, that's probably a good definition of what emotion is. And then you want to modify, and to make a mind healthy, you modify, that is, alter, modulate, whatever you want to call it, you transform that flow toward integration. And then there are these different domains of integration that you can read about in the different books. But basically, how do you teach to monitor more effectively? It's think about a Mindsight camera. You want to have three legs of the tripod of this camera. One is the capacity to be open to what is, to not have this thing where you're shooting on yourself, to be allowing things as they are to be there. And in a sense, that requires that you have a new mind. And you can really teach people how to do this. Another is the capacity to see things as objects of the mind, what we can call objectivity. So there are mental processes that are not your full identity. So it's not identifying with the experience of mind as the totality of who you are. And observation is this incredible capacity we have to have a narrating self. So those kids who didn't eat the marshmallow have a prefrontal development by the age of 4 of a narrating self, where that area primarily resides, that says, you know something, it would be better to have 2 marshmallows than one. I'm not going to eat it. I have the impulse to eat it, but I'm going to put a space between my impulse and action. I'm put my hands in my pocket. I'm going to twiddle around. I'm going to sing, whatever I'm going to do, because I want 2 marshmallows. And you know something? I can wait. Because an impulse is simply an object of my mind's creation, and I don't need to act on it. And obviously they don't do that. I'm anthropomorphizing it. But that's basically what it is. So people with that capacity can monitor energy and information flow and modulate it so they get the 2 marshmallows, and that's why they do better on the SATs. Okay. Now, I'm going to end with a really wild thing to end with. But I got to end with this. I'm going to invite you to come to our website and download a monitoring and modifying practice that if we had more time, I would walk you through it, but now you can just download it for free. If you go to drdansiegel.com, drdansiegel.com, go to the tab that says Resources, and first get the Everyday Mindsight Skills section and do the breath awareness practice, which teaches you to stabilize the monitoring capacity with openness, objectivity, and observation. And then, after you've done that for a week or so, I want you to, or you can download them all at one time, but then go back up on the tab where it says Resources, out of Everyday Mindsight Practices, and go to Wheel of Awareness. And there are 3 versions of it. The wheel, that's right here, the Wheel of Awareness. And download the Wheel of Awareness 1, 2, and 3, but do not do 3 first, unless you're like really ready to go out there. Start with number 1. Because what I want to tell you about that's been so rewarding, I've given this to over 10,000 individuals and across the country, across the world. And no matter what culture people are from, the amazing thing is when they take the time to develop this practice, the results are remarkably similar. And here's, I just want to describe it for you, and then I'll end. Imagine this wheel where the hub is the experience of awareness, the sense of knowing, and within consciousness you also have that which is known, which will be a point on the rim. And this rim of this wheel has everything that could be known, like sight and hearing, or internal experience of the body, like your heart, your intestines. It also has mental life, thoughts and feelings. It also has a sense of connection to others. And the spokes of this diagram are attention. It's where you direct energy and information flow. So after doing the breath practice, people stabilize the capacity to be aware. Then they go to this integration of consciousness practice. So you're basically taking the importance of consciousness in all mental life, and you're introducing the concept of integration to it, and this actually arose as an integration of consciousness exercise, the basic Mindsight skill you can develop. And what you do is you start experiencing what this hub and its relationship to the rim is like. And people find, whatever their background is, professionally or educationally or culturally, they find amazing parallels. And I'll just show you one last slide, and then I'll stop this wild slide. But this is a slide that makes the following proposal. It makes the proposal that if you really say the mind is a process that regulates energy and information flow, which is what we're saying here, and you ask physicists what in the world energy is, and after you get beyond their common statement, which is we have no idea, and they say, well, come on, what is it? And they say it's the potential to do stuff, fine, and then what's that? How's it measured? It's measured as a probability curve that goes along a spectrum between certainty and uncertainty, sometimes called probability. And then if you map out that proposal onto what we're saying, which is the mind is a process that's regulating energy flow, then you come up with the statement that the mind is actually altering where energy is on the probability curve. And suddenly you can explain why 10,000 people doing this Wheel of Awareness practice, whatever their background, have the same experience where they go between, let's say, certainty of a thought, like Golden Gate Bridge, versus a little bit lower on this graph, and I'm not explaining it, but up there is 100% certainty. When you come down lower from the peak, you get to not just a thought, but thinking, which would be lower certainty but higher up, or lower down to a plateau, you get to a mood, or even a bit lower down, you might get to an intention. And then, when you move the probability curve even further down, you find yourself in the experience of awareness. And what this model presents, by using the definition of the mind and the experiential data of thousands of people who've done this from different cultures, you say, wow, so if the mind is truly modifying the energy curve between certainty and uncertainty, then you have a model to show the link between awareness and mental processes. And then whether you're a coach helping the mind of leaders work well so they can help an organization become integrated and function in harmony with creativity and innovation, or you're working with your own life, suddenly you find you're empowered to blend all the sciences together to actually create the following finding, which is kind of amazing. I'll just go through this. We're going to skip over presence and mouth just to go see all these things we could do. We'll skip over this. I'll just say it instead of, it's in your diagram. But here's the thing, because I know I have to end. Here's what I'll just say as a final thing. Yes, we want companies to be more innovative and creative and productive, absolutely. But here's the amazing thing for me in this journey that started a long, long time ago, but especially here in Boston, struggling like I did a third of a century ago, and being so confused and so sad about what was happening to me. And now, standing here in front of you, I can tell you this, and this took a long time to kind of wrestle with this, but it's a simple statement to make. Integration, whether it's in a relationship where you're honoring differences and promoting linkages, or integration where you're literally linking the left and right hemisphere, the higher parts, the lower parts, different memory systems, the limbic area, the cortex, all these different ways. There are 9 domains of integration that I haven't even covered. But you can look at integration across all these different ways in which energy and information flows in the body and in relationships. Integration, if we can promote it in organizations, they will be more productive and innovative. They'll be happier. But integration made visible is kindness and compassion. And so ultimately, this could be a win-win situation where the work you're doing to help people become more profitable in their organizations will actually make their organizations kinder and more compassionate. And can you imagine if the work of coaching ultimately is to create both more innovation and more kindness and compassion, because integration is at the heart of those. What a world we would have. So thank you so much for your attention.